being able to talk to the people who are thinking how to solve these issues with this new technology, which just feels very expansive, and that something like an NFT is like infinitely programmable, and like seeing both the builders in the space providing these places for artists to experiment, and then the artists create, like no two releases are the same. It's like they're all incorporating different I guess if you want to call them different tech stacks, and that they're using different platforms for different purposes to create their own worlds.
You're listening to Lights, Camera, Crypto, the podcast exploring all things entertainment and Web3. I'm your host, Stephen Ladden, and this week our guest is writer, musician, and host of Big Brother and the Holding Company podcast, MacEagon Voyce. Keegan discusses growing up in an artistic household, his love of music, and how music led him to writing and eventually Web3. Let's dive in. Keegan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, man. It's great to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you. And growing up, did you always have an interest in music and entertainment? Was that a residing or presiding interest? Where did you cultivate the early beginnings to the path you're on now?
Yeah. The first memory I have of music is, so I'm from a small town in Minnesota, really small town, about 600 people. And my parents were both elementary school teachers, but both interested in music in some capacity. And I remember dancing around the living room when I was like 2 or 3 to LA Woman by the Doors. And it's like still one of my earliest memories, and it's really visceral. So there's that. And my mom was a piano teacher, and my dad and his whole family like to sing, like still basically every time we get together and do a family gathering, there's always karaoke involved. And yeah, family name is Voice, our family name, so it works. Yeah, I guess I was always connected to music and grew up listening to mostly classic rock type stuff. But I didn't really, I guess I didn't think beyond the actual experiential side of music until probably I got to college. It was always just like a more of a love. I started playing piano because my mom was a piano teacher, and I taught myself guitar a little bit when I was in high school, but I didn't really think, I don't remember thinking like, what is this going to turn into, if anything?
So it was really just something that you enjoyed, were passionate about, but never envisioned how that would parlay itself into something grander.
I spent a lot of time with music. Now that I think about it, it's like I would, when we first got a CD burner on like our old desktop computer, I remember going to the public library all the time and borrowing as many CDs as possible, bringing them back, but they'd all be scratched up and barely listenable, but I still wanted to rip them to my iTunes because it was just cool. I guess there was like a sense of curation and collecting to it that I really enjoyed as well. And like the early days of the internet, getting to do like actual research into the bands and the music, and contextualizing the love for that, something that was like purely sonic with the stories of the people creating them. But yeah, it wasn't until college that I don't know. I played a lot of sports in high school. I think I didn't really think, I don't remember thinking about the future that much, aside from like a pipe dream of being a professional baseball player at some point, I think.
Which everyone at some point, if you've never played baseball, has, and that's instilled in you probably around the T-ball era, I would say,
basically,
when you first can round the bases and then watch what you're doing on TV.
for sure.
Very cool. So you get to college, and is that sort of the merger of music with other interests? How does then your path evolve from there?
Yeah, so I was also in high school. I developed love for like film, and I spent a lot of time watching movies. So when I got to college, I went to a liberal arts school that encourages people to explore. You aren't even allowed to declare a major for your first 2 years. And I thought I wanted to study film, and I started to study film. And that was really cool. I really liked that pursuit. But I realized, I remember having a conversation with somebody. I actually played baseball my first year in college. But I remember, yeah, having a conversation with someone who was on the bus with me, also a baseball player, also a music guy, about my love for film. And I realized, or he actually realized, that it was entirely contextualized and predicated upon my love for music. And that was what I liked. It was like the mood, like creating the mood. I love film as a standalone art form as well, but realized that it was really music that, when I was speaking passionately about film, that is what I was talking about. And he was like, "Why you should study music then?" And I was like, "Well, then maybe I should."
Mm.
So I did, and I switched my focus to music. There's a whole battery of classes that you need to take when you're going to major in something, and that's what I majored in. Amongst which music theory is a big part of it, and music history. And at that point, the music department at the school was like, it wasn't very modern. So music history was like opera and like the romantic era of music, baroque era, the classical era, and it's cool, but it's not where I derive my love of music. Music theory also cool, like important to know for understanding the structure of music. But once you really get into the nitty gritty, it wasn't quite what I was looking for. And so then I switched over to composition and I focused on that, and I focused on vocal performance as well. And I played in a band in college, and that was a lot of fun. I have some very fond memories of some pretty wild shows that we played in basements and other strange places. And yeah, at that point, I just leaned all into music. I had a radio show through the college radio station. Eventually became the music director of our college radio station. I like worked in the concert hall, like arranging scores for the orchestra, and I worked at our student-run music hub called The Cave as a sound engineer, although I would definitely not qualify myself as a sound engineer. That's what I was doing for bands who would come visit and come play. And I think that was also probably like the height of my music discovery. And I think it is for a lot of people getting to college and being independent for the first time. And like music is a natural language of communication,
Sure.
I think. And meeting people who had a lot more exposure to other types of music than I'd had at that point. Like mostly what I'd listened to up until then was classic rock, and then I got like way into new metal late high school and was listening to a lot of Slipknot and Korn and Tool and bands like that. And then being exposed now for the first time to various indie music. Back then it was still just called indie music, and that actually meant something. And folk music and neoclassical music. I got exposed to minimalism, which became very formative for me, and punk and post punk and all of the things. So it was like an explosion in my musical world. And I think after that is when I leaned into it, realized that I still didn't know what I wanted to do after college, but I knew I wanted it to involve music.
And you talk about that sort of explosion of music, and I think college and those years where you have, or in any situation when you're exposed to a variety of different people who all have different tastes, it's really quite an eclectic experience to see. Oh my gosh, I might have only been listening to this one genre, but now there's this whole world out there of these different sounds and these different
Totally.
performers, and yeah, very cool. So then music becomes the central focus. Where do you start to merge music and tech and the Web3 components to your career?
Yeah. It still took a while after that. My first job after college was working at a radio station in Chicago that is called WXRT. It's great. It was like one of the original free-form radio stations back in the 70s, and it was a lot of fun to be there. And I was there for about a year before I left, and I still didn't know what I still didn't know like how I wanted to be involved with music. I knew that I didn't want to follow like I didn't really want to be a performer. Like I remember my vocal instructor I was in college was like encouraging me to get into opera and or theater, and just had no interest in doing something like that.
Was it that you weren't really passionate about it, or? Yeah, about opera specifically.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely do not have a passion for opera. I think it's cool, but that's not what I'm passionate about. I love playing in bands, but I I don't know. I think I didn't at that point have the proactive oomph to continue to pursue bands. I also knew of bands as not this very economically viable path, and had to choose something. And I still wanted to be close to music, so I started writing about it. And someone told me at some point that if I write about music, then I should. If I'm going to go to a show and write about a show, then I should get free entry to that show, and that was a life-changing realization. I was like, oh shit, I can write about music and just go see music for free. And so I started writing. I like had my own blog that was called Hits from the Blog.
Love it.
And slowly but surely, like I started writing for some other blogs still for free, and then started writing like for very small amounts of money. I was like the national indie rock beat writer for AXS, which is like known as being like a kind of a ticketing platform.
Mhm.
They have a TV station as well. Did that for a while. But yeah, mostly at that point I was doing it just to go to the free show. I was going at that point I was living in Boston. I was going to like 4 or 5 shows a week, just riding my bike all over the place. I think I'd had my budget down where I could get one beer at 2 of the 5 shows I went to each week. And yeah, and then after that, I knew the music editors, one of the music editors at Noisy, which was one of the music verticals at Vice, and pitched something to him, a piece, and I wrote that, and it was like a very eye-opening process in terms of being edited for the first time very heavily, and I remember taking it very personally and thinking that I was no good at this thing. Of course, that is just part of the process.
Mhm.
And yeah, moved to New York and continued to write for Vice a lot. And at that point was still just writing about various scenes. Like I was actually covering a lot of experimental New York scenes, talking to these old avant-garde composers, covering some like neoclassical music and people who were writing film scores, and found that really fascinating to be talking to the conceptualists who really gave you a good lens into some of the why behind the music that they were making. And I thought that felt really expansive, both as an art form as like an opportunity to write about it. And it I realizing I haven't even started to answer your question yet, but that's the path up into the point where I got into tech, because being a freelance music journalist living in New York is tough. It's not exactly a lucrative career path, and I just got tired of the hustle of having to write
Sure. Yeah,
about
it's a lot of grind. Yeah.
every little thing. Yeah, I was also writing for Nerdist at the time, and writing like 8 articles a week for them, and writing for Vice, and was just writing a lot. So I accidentally started doing some recruiting work in like tech startups, and that expanded into people operations as a whole. And initially, I had no interest in this thing. I didn't want to be doing it. I just wanted to be doing music stuff. But in hindsight, it I am really grateful for that experience, because it gave me a lens into how tech works and how organizations are structured. Because I was hiring from all of these different perspectives, from C-suite to all the way across to front end engineers to like design interns and marketers, across the whole gamut. So seeing the organization and like the objectives through each of these lenses was actually pretty cool once I figured it out, and got involved. Like that work expanded into doing like culture building and some DEI work and like immigration support. And I actually came to enjoy that quite a bit. And after a couple of years of doing that in tandem with my music journalism, I quit. I quit both for a while and started my own music startup called Gray Matter, which is like a community layer on top of existing streaming services.
Mm.
And continue to pursue that. But thinking back to, this was 2019 when it was first conceived and we first started to work on it, but it feels like, thinking back on that version of myself, it was a very naive version of myself in thinking that I had wherewithal in the music tech space because I had been a music journalist and because I'd done people operations. But the music industry is a very interesting, convoluted space that has a lot of complexities, I think unnecessarily. And yeah, every single day just showed me how little I actually knew about the music industry and music tech
Mm.
specifically. And
And this
just,
is coming from writing extensively in and about the music industry. So that's a interesting realization.
yeah, I wasn't writing about the industry so much then. I was writing about different music scenes and like the artists themselves and the music that they were making. I didn't really touch on the industry itself in my journalism prior to that. And yeah, it was just constant discomfort for a couple years. And the pandemic happened. And I think that's when I returned to Web3 as well. I had been peripherally involved.
As you're pivoting from music back to Web3, but having both worlds be at the forefront, what was it that helped you carve a niche that embodied both lanes?
That's a good question. What it felt like to me is that there were a lot of tech people. There were a lot of very technical people who were building in Web3. And there were a lot of artists also who were playing a dual role of playing around with these different mechanisms for distributing and selling their art and connecting with people and cultivating community. But there seemed to be less of an awareness of kind of the legacy industry, which at that point I understood a bit better after struggling intensely through building a startup in the industry and really expounding upon the benefits of Web3 without and like on chain specifically in regards to music without being blind to the incumbents that still persist and still hold almost all of the power in the music industry. And that sort of that intersection felt like a really interesting juxtaposition, and it's been really cool like being able to talk to the people who are thinking how to solve these issues with this new technology, which just feels very expansive, and that something like an NFT is like infinitely programmable, and like seeing both the builders in the space providing these places for artists to experiment, and then the artists create like no two releases are the same. It's like they're all incorporating different I guess if you want to call them different tech stacks, and that they're using different platforms for different purposes to create their own worlds. And I think it's because like of the decentralized open source ethos of Web3, it allows you to transcend the traditional walled gardens of centralized platforms. And yeah, that idea of world building is really fascinating to me. So thinking about that from a music perspective and like a return to context and a return to a human connection that has been abstracted away from the streaming platforms that we have. I think that all those things made me quite interested in the space and like trying to marry these two things.
Sure. And how then, once you had that as your call it your central focus, how did that road lead to Decential?
Yeah, Decential is actually a part of the early part of that decision. I think when I first started to marry these mechanisms, I was thinking about it more through gray matter, my startup, in how like seeing all of the benefits of Web3, but that it has many challenges. Obviously, it introduces a lot of friction and a lot of it's more expensive, et cetera, than like using something like Spotify. And thinking about like reconceptualizing what gray matter could be as a bridge and start to leverage some of these mechanisms. So that was like my first time thinking about these things. And And then I met Matt actually through FWB, and Matt is the editor-in-chief at Decential, and he had posted wanting to look that he was looking for a writer, and I reached out to him to send him a few clips. And the first piece that I ever wrote for him, first we like had a conversation, and I went well, and I pitched him this piece on this FWB dinner that I was going to here in London, and I wrote about it, and I went well, and then I pitched him this like larger piece on music NFTs, and Matt let me write like close to 4,000 words.
Oh wow.
Um, which I really appreciated because I felt like all of them are warranted, although I do have a bad habit sometimes of forgoing brevity in my
We
writing.
I hear you and I can relate.
It's hard to be succinct. It's like that Mark Twain quote. It's like, if I had more time, I would have written less. And yeah, and that first music NFT piece was like, I still didn't really, I've been thinking about this stuff more conceptually and how it might apply to my startup and that project, but hadn't really been speaking with anybody in the space yet. So that piece was the first excuse I had to reach out to people and like, can you tell me about what you're doing, why you're doing it? Are you like why you're excited about it? And then in that piece, just trying to capture the nuance of the goods and the bads of what music NFTs are and what on-chain music is more generally. I think oftentimes a lot of the rhetoric that exists around Web3 and Web3 music is either very good or very bad. It's either hyper stigmatized or it's seen through rose-colored lenses. And I think there are some good reasons for it to be stigmatized and not, and there are good reasons to be optimistic about it and not. So trying to capture that, and I think that's been my grounding principle as I've continued to write, is to not let myself get dragged too far one way or the other, because it's very easy to go drink the Kool-Aid and or fully reject. Like, there are good arguments that I've read for both. So trying to maintain some sort of neutrality through context. But yeah, that's been my journey with Decential, and that's how it started anyways. And from there, I'm very grateful to have had an opportunity to speak with a lot of the builders and the artists in this space, which has been both a privilege and an incredible opportunity to deepen my own knowledge of what's going on, how it all works, where it's going, things like that.
Yeah, and in terms of those conversations that you're having and in terms of your own show, Big Brother and the Holding Company, how do you continue to walk that line of neutrality while also getting to uncover information from some of these leading voices, and really how have you cultivated community in that sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it helps that pretty much everyone building in the space has really good intentions that are rooted in the right things and similar observations of what's not working in the music industry and what needs to be changed. And because I think it's easier to maintain neutrality when you're speaking with somebody who is talking about their story and their project through the lens of their own story, because it makes sense and it's like there's nothing wrong. Even if like things have changed in the trajectory of a certain project, like when it's told through the lens of story, you understand how people get there. And I think that context is really important. And I think telling that story is, and it's part of the ethos of Decential, something that really resonated with me from the get-go, was we're trying to tell and share these stories through the lens of the builders rather than talk about the tech, because we need to humanize what's going on. And that was amazing. So I think like a lot of my writing and a lot of the features and profiles that I do on people is more rooted in the stories themselves. And from there, what they're actually building, I can let the readers make their own, kind of make up their own minds and establish their own opinions about that. I get a little bit more ranty in my weekly newsletter, which is called The Beat, in which I talk a little bit, but like, I think most of my rants are still against like a lot of the silos and things that exist in Web 2 and like the over financialization generally of the space rather than targeting any individual person. So I guess to answer your question, I think rooting stories in people's stories is the key. And then speaking about trends more generally, targeting anybody is also a key in being able to stay neutral, but also informed and maintain connective relationships as well.
And that element of connective relationships, it's really finding the, as you mentioned, the human elements of the people behind the tech and how, at the end of the day, what they're putting into their work is ideally consistent across the board in terms of, as you mentioned, perhaps there's a lot of altruism and goodwill that is in the space, and it's uncovering those anecdotes and stories and motivations that are powering the product. But those conversations in line, as you're saying, with the Decential mission and the work you're doing, it's figuring out what those motivations are and how people have been able to lean into them to create what they're creating.
Yeah, totally. And I think like it's also important to say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as people say, and there's a big difference between the theory, between like the theoretical side of what people want to do and like how that actually shows up in the actual ways that people behave with communities and technology. I was at EC last week in Paris, which is the Ethereum Community Conference, and was at a talk where someone was talking about this exact thing, thinking about socioeconomic ideas and trying to translate in theory of them how they can be better to like actually being better. And he talked about this meme on one of the slides that he had seen about what it's like thinking about a DAO versus what it's like being in a DAO. And one side is rainbows and chocolate and all these things, and the other person is just like very sad because like how we theorize things are going to turn out generally are not the case, and that's why it's so important to actually find evidence in human behavior and let that be the guide to what people build. And I think that there's a lot of work still to be done on that front and actually finding out what the consumer layer of Web3 looks like. I think pretty generally that also applies to music. But yeah, I think people are thinking about that as well, and I'm excited to see how that manifests.
Sure. And I think what you're underscoring too is the R&D that Web3 presents to, in this case, we'll call it to both the music industry and to other sectors as well, where by interacting with whether it's the existing community in the Discord or through Twitter or whatever platforms people use to engage with the fans of music or the enthusiasts of a product, it's soliciting that feedback so that there's more of a chance that the theory is aligned with the wants and the needs of the people that are participating in the consumption.
Yeah, totally. And that was one of the most exciting things initially about getting back into into Web3 was seeing that manifest on FWB's Discord and seeing the governance structure arise organically through the small community that eventually turned larger, and how they established like a social protocol that worked for them. And after that, like that spurred a lot of theory, and also before that, but I guess that was my beginning into that spurred like a big interest in like things like social governance and thinking more about mechanics behind the structures that we rely on all of the time. And I think that's when I like really started to dive into things like how does the music industry work, like really into the nitty gritty and the granular aspects of like licensing and copyright and who owns Spotify? And what does it mean that these people own Spotify for the rest of the industry? And it created a template for how I think we should probably be thinking about the social structures that surround us and the norms that we embrace, and I think that's been overall pretty healthy, and it's shed a light on the way in which things work, and I think people are demanding a bit more because of that. And I think that's given Web3, because of its, I guess, open source mission oriented nature, by and large, more steam, and I think more credibility by those who have taken the time to understand how it works, or how it could work, anyways.
What do you think, on a personal tip, having taken the time yourself to understand how things work in the space, what's one of the guiding principles that's helped you? And it could just be actually in your career in general. It doesn't have to be Web3 specifically, but what's one of the factors that's helped you bet on yourself when making these moves from initially film to then music to then tech, then coming back to tech after going to music again? How have you remained confident in what you're doing and that eventually the pieces will align as they should?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yes.
I don't think I was that confident for a lot of it. I could think I followed where it was, partially where my interests were pulling me, and partially where like my needs were pulling me.
Sure.
The initial move to tech was not because I wanted to be in tech, but because I needed to make more money than I was. And then, but yeah, I think that the other side of that, moving forward with letting interest pull you in directions, and when you have the privilege for it to allow you to do, I think can be really powerful. I think because I've never really had a job. Like, I've been employed technically for 1 year of my life. I think that's created a different mindset of how I should spend my time, and the opportunities and places in which that time could be spent. And music's always been like the underlying, or I guess overarching theme in this path. But yeah, it's contingent upon a lot of privilege, and I think just waking up every day feeling a little overwhelmed and just taking a moment to meditate and be like, all right, you can do it today.
Yes.
Trying to
One day at a
embrace
time.
resilience as much as possible, and just hoping it works and that I don't fuck it up.
I think to what you're saying, it's hard to fuck it up when, or it's harder to fuck it up when what you're pursuing and what you're involved in is something you are genuinely interested in and genuinely curious about. And perhaps having that deeper level of interest and a deeper level of curiosity allows more malleability to find opportunity and see possibilities that perhaps you wouldn't be thinking about if you were less passionate.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think when you are passionate about something, you're a little bit more willing to deal with failure and confusion and feeling overwhelmed because you're committed to this thing. And I think, yeah, I think like just taking it day by day and continuing to try to channel that passion as much as you can. I think that's, if you have the means, if you have the privilege to do, is not a terrible way to live.
No. And even if you didn't have the means, doing that in your spare time until
Sure,
eventually that becomes the way in which you're providing yourself sustenance could also be a potential path too.
totally. It's happened before, definitely.
Yes. Yes. In terms of means and in terms of current means and in terms of work that you're currently involved in, what can we expect to see from both your work with Decential and your podcast and Gray Matter and everything else?
Yeah, I think regarding Decential, it'll be a lot more of what you've been seeing, if you have been seeing it. I've got a weekly newsletter called The Beat, got a weekly podcast called Big Brother and the Hodling Company, and we'll continue to talk to and write stories about the people in the space who I think are doing the most interesting work to help it achieve, I guess, its greatest potential. And yeah, with Gray Matter, we just launched this kind of tangential music community called the Crate Coalition, which is oriented around the ideas that curation is care and music is interdependent, and that sharing and discovering music with other people is great. And we're organizing in a Discord for the time being, sharing music together, talking about it with more context and more human connection than is allowed or empowered on either streaming platforms or mainstream social platforms. And yeah, we have a weekly conversation series there called For the Record, where we talk about other music people and listen to their stories and what they're listening to. And yeah, and eventually the hope is that we can learn a lot about how people behave around music, how these connective tissues form, and how music is a really powerful vehicle for forming those connective tissues, and build a music specific kind of community platform through Grey Matter and continue to build that in a way that reflects the connective potential of music and bringing people together. So those are a few things.
Very cool. And if people want to check out those few things, where can they find you? Where can they find those projects?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter. It's at MacEagon. That's MacEagon. Grey Matter is at greymatter.fm. That's the website. And if you're into Discord and music, you can find the Crate Coalition there. It's called Crate Coalition. Yeah, there's some good spots, I think.
Right on. Keegan, thank you again for coming on. It's been a pleasure learning more about you and your journey and the inputs to some of your various works and the inspirations for all of it. And I really enjoyed learning that information and also just getting to know you on a slightly deeper level. So
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Stephen, and appreciate the time and the space for me to share. Honestly, I think this is the first time I've ever been on this side of the interview table. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lights, Camera, Crypto, a podcast produced by Matt Bogart and Decential Media. Music by Brian Duncan and Kareem Imes. If you enjoyed this experience, be sure to rate and subscribe to our show and to follow @Sladden and @Decential Media for additional content.